October 1959. Great Bend, Kansas, the county seat of Barton County, 40 miles west of Hutchinson on Highway 56, where the Arkansas River bends south through wheat stubble that has gone the color of old bone, and the harvest dust has settled on every flat surface in town. A doctor's office on Main Street has a waiting room with 5 chairs, a magazine rack with a farmer's almanac from the spring that nobody has moved since April, and a frosted glass window between the patients and the woman who controls admission to the examining rooms. A man in a canvas work coat with cracked leather at the boot toe has been in one of those chairs for 35 minutes. The woman behind the frosted glass is explaining to him that the office requires payment in advance. Here is the story. Walter Pruitt had farmed the same 340 acres of winter wheat in Barton County for 31 years, which means he had farmed them through the Dust Bowl, which is not something most people who have not done it can fully understand. The topsoil in Barton County, Kansas, left for Texas in a series of brown afternoons in 1934 and 1935, and Walter Pruitt was 32 years old and stayed anyway and planted anyway and lost the crop both years and broke even in 1936 and turned a profit in 1937 and did not consider any of this exceptional because it was just the farm, and the farm was what he had, and there was nowhere else to be. His wife Margaret died of a stroke in the spring of 1953 and left him with the 340 acres and a house that held too much of what she had arranged in it for him to move any of it without meaning something he was not prepared to have it mean. The kitchen still had her curtains, yellow cotton with a small blue pattern faded from washing, that let the morning light through thin and diffuse across the breakfast table, like something that had traveled a considerable distance to arrive there. He kept the curtains. He kept everything where she had put it. He got up at 5 every morning and went to bed after the 10 o'clock news and considered himself adequately organized for a man alone on 340 acres. The cough started in August. He put it down to harvest dust, because harvest in Barton County throws enough wheat chaff into the air to make a healthy man cough for 2 weeks. But the harvest ended, and September came, and the cough did not leave with it. By October it had a depth to it, a settled quality, and there was some tightening across his chest on the cold mornings that he did not like, but did not examine too closely, because examining it too closely was not going to plant the winter wheat. He drove into Great Bend on a Tuesday and walked into the office of Dr. Clement Marsh on Main Street. Marsh had treated him twice before. The office smelled of antiseptic and old wood, and the faint medicinal smell that accumulates in a space where sick people have been bringing their problems for 20 years. The linoleum in the waiting room was worn pale at the threshold in a path that ran straight from the door to the front window. He gave his name and took a chair and waited. Some of you know what it means to have run the same engine for 30 years and feel, for the first time, that something inside it has changed. Some of you have sat in a chair like that one and tried to make the symptoms sound smaller than they were, because smaller was easier than the alternative. This story is for you. The harvest of 1959 had been poor. A late rain in July arrived during the wrong phase of grain development and knocked the protein content of the wheat below the premium grade threshold at the elevator, which cost Walter 11 cents a bushel on 6,200 bushels, which is a difference of $682 that one afternoon of July rain removed from his year without asking. He had $9 and some coins in his coat pocket when he sat down in the waiting room. The receptionist's name was Patricia. She had worked for Dr. Marsh for 7 years and was not an unkind person, and understood within 2 sentences of Walter's explanation that there was going to be a problem with the payment arrangement. The office required $14 in advance for an initial examination of a new complaint, a policy Dr. Marsh had put in place in 1957 after 3 consecutive quarters of uncollectible receivables from patients who had meant to pay and had not been able to. Walter told her through the frosted glass that he could pay the balance by Friday when his grain check cleared. He mentioned the 6 weeks of cough. He mentioned the chest pressure in the cold mornings. He said it in the flat, specific way of a man who has been doing agricultural accounting by hand for 31 years and knows exactly where every number lives. Patricia went to find Dr. Marsh. She came back and slid the window open and said that the office could refer him to the county public health clinic on 4th Street, which operated on a sliding scale. She said it carefully, because she was a careful person, and careful people know when information is not the same thing as help. Walter sat down. He looked at the farmer's almanac in the rack. He did not pick it up. There were 4 other people in that waiting room. A woman with a child. A man in his 40s with his arm in a makeshift sling. 2 others. Every one of them had heard the exchange through the frosted glass window, because the window was glass and the room was small, and the human voice carries through glass when what it is saying is the kind of thing this was. Not one of them looked at Walter. The room developed the particular quality of a space where people have agreed, without speaking, to become very interested in the middle distance. You know that feeling. The moment when something wrong settles into a room and every person in it decides it arrived with someone else and will have to leave with someone else. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story gets. John Wayne was in the 4th chair from the door. He was in Great Bend because the front left wheel bearing on his truck had failed on Highway 56 east of town that morning, and the garage on Kansas Street had pulled the wheel and expected to have it done by 3 in the afternoon. He had a bruised rib from a fall on a property inspection in Colorado the previous week that he had decided, sitting in the garage waiting room, was probably worth having a doctor look at before it became something a doctor definitely needed to. He had walked 2 blocks to Marsh's office and put his name on the sign-in sheet and taken the 4th chair and opened a Field and Stream from March and been on page 12 when Walter Pruitt came through the door. He had set the magazine down. He had heard the full exchange. He had watched Walter sit back down and look at the almanac without picking it up. He looked at the man with the sling. He looked at the woman with the child. He looked at the frosted glass window. He stood up. He walked to the window and tapped once on the glass and waited. Patricia slid it open. Wayne said, "What does a complete examination run? Everything. Chest assessment. Any required testing. Give me the top of the range." Patricia said the range on a thorough visit with imaging was $35 to $50. Wayne said, "Schedule Mr. Pruitt before me. Whatever the visit costs and whatever the testing costs, put it on one bill. I'll cover it." Patricia looked at him through the window the way people look at something that has not finished becoming real yet. Wayne said, "He's had the cough 6 weeks, and there's pressure in his chest in the mornings. Schedule him first." She slid the window closed. Wayne walked back and stood in front of Walter Pruitt's chair. Walter was looking up at him with the expression of a man who has heard something that has not yet traveled all the way from the ear to the understanding. Wayne said, "They'll take you in a few minutes. The bill is handled." Walter said, "I don't take charity." Wayne's voice dropped. He said 31 years of wheat in Barton County feeds people in places that have never heard of Barton County, Kansas, and don't know enough to be grateful for it. You've been paying forward your whole working life. This is not charity. This is a fraction of what you're owed." Walter looked at him. He looked at his hat, which was in his hands. He said, "I know who you are." Wayne said, "Doesn't matter who I am. It matters that the doctor sees you this morning." He went back to the 4th chair and picked up the Field and Stream and found page 12. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The woman with the child was not looking at the wall. The man with the sling was looking at the floor, with an expression that had shifted from what it had been 20 minutes earlier. The change in a room when one person acts is not loud and does not require explanation. It simply changes the air. Patricia came to the door and called Walter Pruitt's name. Dr. Clement Marsh examined Walter for 50 minutes. The chest assessment required an X-ray that the office ran in a back room smelling of developer fluid and imaging chemicals. The plate showed a mass in the lower left lobe. Marsh sat on the rolling stool and told Walter what he was looking at in the plain language of a doctor who knows that people hear better when the words are simple. He said it needed a biopsy. He said the word mass covered a range of outcomes, and that some of them were manageable, and that they needed more information before they knew what they were managing. Wayne had left a note with Patricia that the billing should be forwarded to his production office in California. The visit and the referral came to $62. The specialist in Hutchinson was an additional $90. The mass was benign. A granuloma, the specialist said. Common in agricultural workers in the Central Plains, likely from a fungal exposure years prior. Not the other thing. Walter drove home from Hutchinson on a Friday afternoon in November, with the windows down in the cold. And something lifted from his chest that had been there since August, and that had nothing to do with the cough, which was already resolving with antifungal medication at $4 a month from the pharmacy on Main Street. He sat at the kitchen table under Margaret's faded curtains that evening and did the arithmetic on a notepad in his small, economical handwriting. He circled the number at the bottom of the column once. Below the column, on the same page, he wrote a name. He farmed the 340 acres for 14 more years. Here is what $62 in October of 1959 became. 14 harvests of winter wheat in Barton County, Kansas. 14 planting seasons on ground that had stayed in one man's hands through the Dust Bowl and the lean years, and one Tuesday morning in a doctor's waiting room when it nearly lost the man who farmed it. At an average of 6,000 bushels per year over 14 years, Walter Pruitt put approximately 84,000 bushels of hard red winter wheat into the grain system of the central United States after the October morning that almost ended his ability to do so. That is not a number that fits into ordinary accounting. It is the kind of number that lives in the background of bread and flour and the supplies in every kitchen that draws from the Kansas grain elevators, which is to say it lives in the background of a great deal of American life without anyone knowing whose name is attached to it. Walter's son Raymond came back from Wichita in 1972 and learned the operation in the last year before Walter handed it over. Walter died in 1981. Raymond is in his 80s now and still works the northeast section of the original acreage. The ground Walter cleared himself in the early years. The ground that held when the rest of Barton County was trying to become part of Texas. Raymond's son farms the rest. Between the three of them, the Pruitt name has been on that wheat ground continuously since 1928. That approaches 100 years. The late July rain of 1959 and the Tuesday morning of October 1959 are the two closest calls that ground has had since the Dust Bowl, and both of them passed. The notepad with the circled number and the name is in a kitchen drawer in the farmhouse east of Great Bend. Raymond found it when he went through the house after Walter died and put it in the drawer, and has left it there since 1981. Margaret's curtains came down in the early 1970s when the fabric finally gave at the rod. But the window they covered still lets the morning light through at the same angle, thin and traveling far to arrive at the kitchen table, the way she liked it. If you drive east from Great Bend on the county road south of Highway 56, you can find the Pruitt ground by the cottonwood windbreak along the north edge that Walter planted in 1949. The cottonwoods are taller than the elevator in town now. Raymond's truck is near the equipment shed by 7 in the morning, most days. The winter wheat comes up green in the early spring and goes gold by August, and comes back green again the following spring, the way it has been doing on that ground since 1928, in the cycle that has no beginning anyone living can name. Some of you know what it means to drive home from a specialist with the windows down in November, because the news was the news you needed it to be. Some of you have sat at a kitchen table with a notepad and done arithmetic that came out different than you feared. This story is for you. And it is for the Tuesday morning that went the way it went instead of the way it could have. John Wayne left Great Bend at 3 in the afternoon when the wheel bearing was done and drove west on Highway 56 and did not tell anyone about the note he left with Patricia, or the $62, or the $90, or the man who drove home from Hutchinson in November with the windows down. Not in any interview in the years that followed when people asked him about the American farmer, or about Kansas, or about ordinary people living with dignity in hard circumstances. Not in any letter that has been found. Patricia told her sister in Salina. The sister told it at a church gathering. It traveled the way true stories travel through small cities, horizontally and quietly, in the voices of people who heard it from someone who was there. Dr. Marsh changed his payment policy 2 weeks after that Tuesday in October. He changed it without announcing the change and without explaining it to his staff, which Patricia noticed and understood without asking. He retired in 1971 and lived with the memory of a waiting room where 4 people sat and watched a frosted glass window and held still, and one man in the 4th chair from the door put down a magazine and got up. And what that difference cost, and what it made. What a man does when a room goes quiet and decides to be somewhere else is decided in about 4 seconds and requires nothing except the willingness to stand up. Wayne had a bruised rib and a magazine from March and 4 hours to spend on a wheel bearing, and he stood up and walked to the window. And a farmer in Barton County, Kansas, lived to see 14 more harvests on ground his family has not stopped farming. That is what standing up looks like. That is all it costs. That is what it makes. Subscribe if this story deserves to be told. There are more of them, and every one of them does. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.